All right, well, it's 5 o'clock, and so we have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm Dr. Susan English, Dean of the School of Education at Aquinas College. Thank you to our panelists who are joining us tonight, and thank you to all of you who are attending. We appreciate your time and your interest in this topic. At Aquinas, we recognize that teaching is a vocational calling, and it has the power to impact our students as well as the greater society. And so we want to approach this topic to learn and grow so that our impact will be positive and constructive. With that in mind, I'd like to read a short prayer to get us in the right mindset. Merciful Lord, thank you for calling us together for this event. We seek your blessing on our discussion and ask that you open our hearts and minds as we seek to better understand our biases and the impact of systemic racism on the children and families we serve. Forgive us, Lord, for all the times when we have failed to love and respect others. Inspire us to take steps that will lead toward a more just and compassionate society. All this we ask in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I'd like to now turn this over to Dr. Stephanie Boutelier, who is our moderator for tonight.
Thank you, Susan. Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephanie Boutelier, and I'm an Associate Professor of Education at the School of Education at Aquinas. Thank you for all of you for being here tonight, not only our panelists, but also our attendees. We would like to acknowledge the fact that we are talking about a broad topic of bias and systemic racism. And tonight we have 4 wonderful changemakers from our community who identify as Black. And we do want to acknowledge that there are other people out there who identify in other races and other intersectionalities that also fit into this category. So we hope to continue that conversation later with other speakers as we continue this meaningful conversation. I'd like to welcome Ashanti Bryant, Dr. Shirley Johnson, India Manns, and Deacon Shomari Tate. They will each provide their own short introduction.
So I think I am the first on the Brady Bunch Hollywood Square screen here. Ashanti Bryant. I'm Director of Early Childhood Services at IFF, which is a community development financial institution that works across 10 states in the Midwest. I live in Grand Rapids though, and I'm a former administrator at Grand Rapids Christian Schools, and also served on several boards of charter schools. I've also served as an adjunct faculty member at the Aquinas College, and really appreciative of this courageous space being created to have this conversation.
Thank you. My name is Shirley Johnson, and what can I say? I've devoted my life to public service. For the past 35, 36 years, I've worked in education and in teaching and learning to some capacity. Also, I have worked in a variety of positions: assistant principal, principal, director, and for 10 years, I was assistant superintendent at Kentwood Public Schools. After 36 years of rich and rewarding service, I retired in June. And so I am trying to explore the next chapter and find something meaningful so that I can continue to contribute. And so when it comes to these topics, they cannot be overstressed or understated. It's very important work. The district that I worked in for 25 years, we had a significant amount of work taking place. And so I don't consider myself to be a diversity and inclusion expert by any means. I've never held the title, but certainly as a Black female administrator, for 20 plus years, I've had direct experiences and I've witnessed experiences. And so I do appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this process.
Hi, I'm India Mann. There's an echo. Is there something I should do? Okay, all right. I'm born and raised in Detroit. We moved here in 2013, meaning my husband and my family, my son. I'm not an educator, so it's a great privilege to be on this panel. I'm actually a person that was kind of pushed into my work because of the way that our son was treated in 8th grade when we moved here. And what I soon noticed is that how he was treated was, it wasn't an outlier. It was a lot of, there were a lot of Black families in Grand Rapids that had kids in what I call the outlier schools, meaning not necessarily Grand Rapids public schools, but schools in the surrounding area that were had similar experiences. And so the work that I initially started for our son, but soon after that, it was kind of for everybody's children. So that's kind of my story.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shimari Tate. I'm a Grand Rapids native. Actually, I was born and raised here. I am a graduate of Michigan State. I received my bachelor's from MSU, my master's from MSU, and a lot of my work and a lot of my research revolved around the topic of critical race theory, social justice, urban sustainability as relevant topics. And now I'm in the educational space working at Grand Rapids Catholic Central High School, and I serve as our director of equity and multiculturalism. I also work, I have a bivocational schedule, and I work as an educator, and then I also work as a minister in Lansing and in Grand Rapids. So that's my short summary of who I am.
Okay. Okay.
Great. Thank you again, all 4 of you, for being here. Those of you who are attendees, if you do have questions, you have the option to add your question in the Q&A at the bottom, but we have questions for our panelists tonight. If we have time at the end, we will try to address any attendees' questions. And we'll start with the first question. What examples of bias in the PK12 school setting have you seen or experienced?
I don't want to jump in. I'm not sure how, what the sequence will be and how we will respond, but I will certainly share one experience that I think is very relevant here. We recently, as a district, every year we engage in professional development that helps us to become more effective as we work with a diverse range of students, whether they're English learners or African-American students or Asian students. The district has a huge English learner population. And when I started there years ago, we had 16% minority students. And when I retired, we had almost 60%. So with that demographic change and shift, of course, there were experiences noted along the way, which I think were aha to me and to maybe many staff members. The one issue that was certainly brought to the forefront of a lot of administrators and a lot of support staff, teachers, is one that has to do with Black girls. And I'm sure maybe the panelists have heard about it. I was just really enlightened because I think a lot of our attention has been around African-American boys, and justifiably so, and English learners, but it seemed as if the idea and the notion of Black girls and their underachievement and how they are being criminalized was on the back burner, or it really just wasn't. It was being lost through the cracks somehow. And so we just kind of immersed ourselves with information from Dr. Monique Morris. You may have heard of her. She has a book. She has several books, 3 or 4 books, but probably the best one that I think is this called Push Out. And the Push Out book basically just lets you know how there's cultural bias. There's strong cultural bias, maybe against African-American girls, primarily based on misperceptions and misconceptions about their attitude, their disposition, how they interact with authority figures, things of this nature. And the research is showing that this is happening with Black girls at an alarming rate, and they are being sent to detention centers. They're the victims of higher proportions of discipline, whether it's suspensions, expulsions, or just removal from class. Black girls have been the target of a great deal of misunderstanding. And she also expressed that, of course, none of this is, or some of it may not be intentional, but it's unintentional that the perceptions of Black girls are that they are mouthy, sassy, not vulnerable, but problematic and defiant, etc. And so if teachers will misinterpret that behavior instead of trying to build relationships, engage in some kind of intimacy with these students, and understand their full educational experience, and sometimes the trauma that these Black girls bring into the school setting with them, then it can certainly create opportunities and spaces for healing and for partnerships, better relationships between families and students, families and oops, oh my, I think I did that. Crap. Okay.
You're still there with us, Shirley.
Am I still there? Okay, sorry about that.
I was wondering, I have a quick follow-up to.
Go ahead. I was coming to the end of that anyhow. Mm-hmm.
I was just curious if you could elaborate a little bit more. Oh, now she's gone. All right. When she returns back with us, I'll ask her a quick question, but do either, there she is. Okay, does anyone else have a response to that initial question?
I think it's important that we maybe take a couple of steps back and, sort of just even define bias and define racism. And bias is really a prejudice or a favoring of one group or a specific characteristic over another. That's just sort of a broad definition of bias. And frankly, we all have bias. All of us on this call, all 53 of us on this virtual conversation have some level of bias. Another thing to acknowledge is that then racism is really the systemic and even systematic application of bias in all areas of a community or a country or a society or a school system or a classroom, right? Those structures. And so I just wanted to just quickly define that for all these educators and associated people on the call. We all have bias. We have to learn to address it and manage it. We all have it. Racism, though, is really it's an application of that bias systemically and systematically. So I wanted to do that. I also wanted to say one of the ways that bias and racism can appear in a school or in classrooms is in that even for African American or Black children, and Black, we can unpack who's Black. Is the biracial kid Black? I mean, like who's Black? We can unpack, okay, who's Black? But that's a longer conversation. But I guess I would just also say that there's in every racial group or ethnic group there is not, the groups, Black people are not monolithic. Hispanic, Latinx people are not monolithic. There's not just one sort of just profile of Black people. And so what happens is all kinds of things get applied to students in schools in preschool through 12th grade, sometimes because we're viewing a specific group as monolithic, as just being one way, based on our bias, based on how we have been acculturated or shaped, if you will. Oh my goodness, how many examples of what it could look like? It appears in literature. It appears in the curriculum. It appears in suspension rates and who gets suspended or disciplined in schools. It appears in how we populate AP and honors classes. It can appear in referrals for special education assessments and get tested. It also could appear in guidance and in the college placement process. And it most certainly, Shimari, can appear in athletics and how students show up in the athletic worlds of schools, if you will, starting at the elementary level. So that's what I think this space is for. I mean, we can discuss more details, but I really want to back up and make sure that you have as a takeaway that bias is something that we all have. We have to learn to manage it and address it, and then and therefore we can dismantle racist structures and the system of racism that has appeared and still appears today in schools and in classrooms.
Thank you for that, Ashanti. I would piggyback off and say, let's take it a couple more steps back and look at the psychology behind bias and why at young ages, we're not taught how to socialize along racial lines. You know, you're taught to socialize in all of these different manners, but you're never taught the proper psychology of how biases form and how racism forms. So I take a step back and say that one clear example of bias that I've seen in the classroom is just the pervasiveness with which teachers approach the topic of race and culture. I mean, issues of racial bias and racism are typically discussed as something that has happened in the past or something that is happening to another group of people. And we don't really look at it as an us and our problem. We look at it as a they and them problem. And I think that we also have an issue of teaching the topic of race and bias and things of this nature as objective topics. In the same spirit that we would teach math or science, we should approach that same type of objectivity with race. Race always takes on the connotations of being political. And I think it has to take a couple of steps above that just to appeal to academic. I think the topic of bias, the topic of race has turned into a scholarship as opposed just to a topic of discussion.
Well, I would say from a layman's perspective, we have to look at perception and treatment, you know, how the children are being perceived and in turn, how they're being treated. Going back to 8th grade, we had a nun tell our son, in his particular class, there were 28 kids and there were 5 children of color. One was a girl. So, and I don't, not to separate her out, but my son, he hung with the 3 guys, not necessarily the girl. But I had a nun tell him that he shouldn't hang out with them because they were up to no good. And, you know, I didn't see anything wrong with these children. And if, you know, we thought or had any perception that there were anything wrong with these kids, we would have, you know, kind of guided him maybe to stay away from them. But he literally was told. And he, with his own eyes, witnessed how, through his own perception, how he thought that the priest at the school treated the kids of color in his class different than he treated the other kids. And that was, you know, his perception at the time. And all, you know, I'm taking all of this in, and it's, so, you know, you have a child tell you something like that, and you're, you know, you kind of want to stand back and watch. You certainly don't want to just run off with that kind of information. But, you know, just things kept adding up, and then, you know, things make sense. Can I 100% say for sure that that is something that, you know, the priest was doing? No, I can't. But I can say through some other actions that that particular priest took, that I do believe that more than likely what our son said was true. So my best recommendation to the educators that are out there that are learning and coming up through the system, you know, I think you just always need to be aware of what your perception, as Ashanti mentioned, your bias. Just be very conscious of the bias that you're bringing to the table, that you're showing up with on a daily basis, and how, you know, how is that, how are the students seeing that? You know, what actions are you taking because of a bias that you have? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Can any of you expand with on this topic, on examples of privilege or power that teachers may not be aware of, and how ignoring this might perpetuate systemic racism, or how we can shift the narrative of these topics?
Yeah, again, those big terms, right? We have to unpack them. Privilege, power.
Yeah.
They're two different things, right? So, so privilege is really, I mean, privilege has to do with acknowledging that, that, you know, in education, and as in the country, you know, there we have a history, and that history is most certainly rooted in racism, and, you know, the historians would argue from the very origin of the country. So, I mean, the recognition of privilege it also comes with the recognition that I, as an educator, and let's use the example of a white female educator, which most educators in the country are white females, have a different lived experience than my students of color in my classroom. There's a recognition of that. And that comes through unpacking all kinds of things like self-awareness of educators and an educator's own cultural awareness, and awareness of a teacher or an educator's background. So privilege shows up in all kinds of ways, and I think privilege also can be linked. It begins to start moving into how there's an intersection between race and socioeconomics. And so, you know, so my wife is an educator. She's a kindergarten teacher. I'm married to an African-American woman. Our children attend private schools. And our children in Grand Rapids, Michigan today are attending schools in person. That's privilege. I have to acknowledge that that's a privilege, because most children today in Grand Rapids, Michigan, if they attend a Grand Rapids public school, are not attending in person. They have to participate in a virtual learning I think to date, unless something has changed from Dr. Roby, the new superintendent at GRPS.
I think that's still the case, yeah.
Right, so that is privilege. It's an acknowledgement that I am in a certain position that maybe other people are not in. And I'm an African-American male who has privilege because I have a certain level of income or whatever, and my children are able to access a private school where they can learn in person. I also think power is another interesting term to really unpack as it relates to schools. And yeah, and I think teachers and school leaders have to really wrestle with power in the culture of their community, in terms of even who gets voice, who makes decisions, who can inform, like how are we informed on the things that we do. I'll give an example of, you know, at a school, I've had years of school leadership. So I had an example where students, we conducted several focus groups. I'll try to go quickly. We conducted several focus groups with students of color. So students who identified as African American, Black, Latino, Hispanic, students of different ethnic groups within that are Asian, and then white students of different ethnic groups. And we asked them all the same question. How does race show up at school for them? And they all, so the white students were really silent, because they didn't really know how to respond to that question. The African American students, which I'll stay on this group, the African American students chimed in immediately, and they talked about the fact that they did not have teachers who looked like them. Yep. They talked about the fact that in their school, the Black males got more attention or more shine than the Black females did. I think Dr. Johnson was alluding to this. Some of that was because of athletics.
Sure.
Is because the boys, if they were involved in athletics, they got more attention. The Black females talked about being treated like they were older than what they were. So adults, like treated as adults when they were little girls.
Exactly.
And having people touch their hair and as if they were a pet or an animal. And just not really acknowledging their humanity, or that they were just girls in some cases. These kinds of things came out. So power really has to do with the voice, the acknowledgement that they are connected. Power and privilege are connected, but there's an acknowledgement of, if you are a white person teaching children of color, that there is a complete difference in position, if you will, that you have and that you show up with, regardless of where you live, regardless of your income level, just because of American cultural dynamics and how we historically value skin color over other skin colors within our country. There's so much to unpack. This is a course, you guys. This is a course we could take, right? And I'm sure my colleagues want to tag in, so I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Well, I just want to stick in just a little, because my answers were, because I'm not an educator, so my answers are not going to be that broad. But I just want educators to know that they have the power to neutralize the situation, because as we know, children are not. Well, you do, Ashanti just told us that we all have a bias. And so, I'm sure children develop a bias or something. I don't know if they're born with one, but a lot of what they bring into the school environment. So most of what I'll speak from, I'll speak from from what students are getting from other students, not necessarily from the staff. But teachers have the power to neutralize that. And I think they need to know that they have the power to neutralize, because they have the children for so many hours of the day, and some of that bad information that they're getting at home can be neutralized if they give them the right information and the right tools to work with during the day. Because children are naturally curious, and so they're gonna try to balance out that information, and through encounters and relationships they'll find that that information was correct. That nice thing that teacher said, or the way the teacher told them to look at this particular situation, actually proved to be true. And what wasn't true was some of that they heard coming out of their home. And so if I can encourage anything, I would just encourage them to know the power that they have to fertilize the flowers, I should say.
That's really going back to the original question of privilege versus power. I think Ashanti did a great job differentiating those two. And I think one example of how they both kind of are at work in school systems, especially in our area, is when educators begin to think of race, and I'm speaking to predominantly white educators, when our white educators begin to think about race as a they-them problem, instead of, again, that us-our problem, meaning that injustice happening anywhere, I mean, that's an injustice to you too. I can't be free until my brother or my sister is free. And I just want to be really, really crystal clear when I say this, but there is no person on this call, there is no person in this country living right now that is responsible for causing racism and bias. No one's responsible for that, but we are all called to fight against it and to eradicate it. So when we start to do that, we begin to work against the negative aspects of privilege and power, and we begin to use our privilege and power in a way that is positive. One direct example of both privilege and power independently at work in one situation would be when a student of color that's being marginalized, oppressed, facing issues of discrimination, what have you, when they bring that issue to an educator, and then the educator automatically justifies the situation as something that may not have to do with race, or may not have to do with whatever issue they're bringing up. When that happens, this is a dangerous zone to be in, and how to mediate these issues and remedy these issues, because one, you have the privilege to think of something else other than race, which is what that student is feeling. And then two, you also have the power to take the attention off of something that we probably need to focus on. So like I said, explanations and conflict resolution strategies like this are dangerous, and we really have to treat instances of bias, racism, as such until we have indisputable proof that it's not that. And when we start to train students to not see instances of racism for what they are, we are training them to also perpetuate the very behaviors that we claim to be against. And this goes into bias. A thing about implicit bias is sometimes a person believes something and they don't implicitly know that they're working against it, just subconsciously. So that's one aspect of implicit bias. When we deal with implicit and explicit bias, do we see them, or are they hiding underneath the surface?
I want to rattle off a couple of just examples for, okay, Ashanti, I'm a white female teacher. What am I going to do? I don't even know where to start, right? I want to give a couple of activity strategies for white female teachers in an elementary school. So you have the privilege of having books that look like you and your and all white children. So even in your literature, it will take some work, but find literature that is reflective of the racial and culture of the children who you are teaching. They exist. It exists today, and it's a growing body of literature and materials and curriculum that are reflective of the children who you are teaching. Also, acknowledge the culture of the children that you're teaching. Because often kids come to school and they have to completely turn off the culture of their family, of their community, of their church, of how they learn. Dr. Chris Emdin, who is one of my favorites, he wrote a book for white teachers who are teaching in the hood. I don't know if that's the exact title. Dr. Christopher Emdin, E-M-D-I-N, has a great book, and he talks about really Pentecostal pedagogy. And what he's referencing is the fact that let's say African American children, church going at, because church and church culture is not monolithic. Not all Black people attend church. Some are Muslims, some are atheists, some are etc. But within our country, church culture affects African American children. And if you go to a Pentecostal church, the way people learn and grasp ideas, etc., is it has a whole style to it that should be acknowledged and potentially even replicated in a classroom, in terms of how music is used and call and response is used, and it's all those strategies that are used that are part of children's culture outside of school. So there has to be acknowledgement of those kinds of things. I just want to rattle off a couple of ideas so that teachers can begin to think, okay, what can I practically do in my preschool classroom? What can I do in my kindergarten, first, second grade, third grade, fourth grade classroom? And if there are, because this question up in the chat and in the Q&A. What about hiring people of color as classroom teachers? And we always go to the white institutions. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, people. First of all, generally speaking, educators are not paid well. Can I get an amen? Not paid well.
Right.
We need to compensate educators better. Further, African-American people, many African-Americans who would earn a college degree are not interested in going into a field where you're going to make a salary you can't even pay off your student loans.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's right.
If
That's
we're keeping all things real here, people.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a sector that needs more investment. Teachers in general need to be compensated more. If we're going to hire and recruit and attract talent from communities of color, we have to incentivize people. We have to support them in college. We have to support them in higher education, which is a whole other piece. We have to offer them opportunities to be able to finance their education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to rattle off some things as strategies because we only have an hour of time, but I want to give my colleagues opportunity to chime in.
Ashanti, I appreciate you really underscoring the need for curriculum materials, textbooks, references, to not just show a European viewpoint, but to show a variety of cultural experiences and ethnicities and everything, because it helps to validate the student. It helps to encourage them. It helps to let them know that their aspirations are not, their aspirations can be followed through on, and they can be successful as the teachers that are there. I think some other things, not necessarily what the teacher can do, but what districts can do, is that we've had for years these sensitivity workshops. Well, I think that some districts are beginning to really move beyond that and be very intentional about bringing in professional development that helps teachers to examine their explicit bias, implicit bias, understand how their interactions with students are impacting the students. It's a continuous self-assessment all the time so that they can understand where institutional racism comes from, what kinds of policies and practices that they're currently engaged in that they may not even have an awareness that they're doing this, i.e. case in point. A couple years ago, the district that I was working in had to dismantle their admissions policy because the residency policy was asking for a driver's license and maybe 4 or 5 other items that families had to have before they registered in this district. And it was brought to our attention, and we were just thinking, wow, we just didn't want, you know, to accept everybody. We wanted to adhere to the auditing rules that everybody had to be a resident within a particular attendance zone. But what we didn't realize what we were doing by asking people for a driver's license, those persons that were undocumented actually couldn't meet that standard. And so we were thinking like, oh my gosh, are we leaving out a group of individuals who can't even apply for school because they don't have a driver's license or because they're not on the rental agreement or mortgage documents, et cetera. So we began to have not just professional development, but cultural competency training to all new employees, not just to help them to value and appreciate the differences that show up in the district, but how to challenge instances where they see discrimination taking place, giving us some real life scenarios, people being allowed to share their personal experiences, and that somehow opens up a space as well so that people are not saying you're guilty and I'm innocent, but they're saying this is what happened to me. Just creating those opportunities for different staff of color to be able to share with their colleagues different encounters that they're having. I have found that to be extremely valuable, and it's enlightening to those that think that the status quo is acceptable.
Thank you all for providing such great experiences and action steps for teachers so far. I was wondering if any of you have any insight into tying some of these topics into digital equity, because currently, Ashanti touched on it briefly earlier, the privilege of being in a classroom is much different than a hybrid or a fully virtual classroom. So if you could spend a few minutes chatting about that, I think that would be a great topic to address.
Yeah, I'll come back to it and say that there's really no excuse. We have the resources to be able to equip communities with internet access, with the technology that they need to learn virtually. There's really no excuse. We all scrambled because of this global pandemic. But before the global pandemic, when we were assigning Google Classroom homework assignments and all of that, those same kids did not have the internet. Those same families did not have access necessarily, or their devices had to be left at the school, or et cetera. And then further, the equipping of parents with how to create a learning environment in your home.
Oh my gosh, yes, yes. Oh, so true.
Go ahead, Dr. Johnson. You have something to say. Go ahead.
Exclamation point. But that's so good. When you talk about under-resourced families, you're talking about under-resourced families, those that may not have libraries in their home, you know, an extra supply of books to read from, internet access. Everyone assumes that every child has a laptop, internet access, but there are lots and lots of families that are caught up in a survival mode that do not have access to this. So again, we're talking about more privilege there.
I would just like to go into kind of a framework that I used to approach this work when COVID-19 hit, because of how specific that issue was, especially given the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion in times where strained and oppressed and marginalized communities were faced with even more of a burden. So there's a framework, and I'll be happy to share it as a resource. It's from a strategy guide known as the National Institute of Inclusive Excellence. That is headed by Dr. Damon Williams. He is a great resource. I suggest all educators start using this resource. And so the framework goes like this. Step number one, when we're trying to deliver digital excellence, is we got to make culturally relevant decisions. So we really have to be cognizant and privy of what are our constituents going through, what is the demographic makeup, and who do we need to focus on. And by focusing on them, we begin to, step two, support the diverse communities that exist within our institutions. And then we have to talk about this as a faculty and staff. So as a faculty and staff, there has to be intentional time set aside for us to figure out how do we deliver the same outreach resources to our challenged students or to our students of color in a way that is thoughtful, inclusive, and effective, and meets their needs just as much as someone who is seeing this problem as not that much of a burden outside of going to school on their computer. And then the last thing that we have to do, and I think everyone should start doing this now, begin to plan and structure your courses and your curriculums from the means of being digital. So you can teach them still in the classroom, but just in case we got to go back online for whatever reason, because this pandemic is proving to be unpredictable, you'll be ready, and you'll be ready to go. And the adjustment will be that much easier because you've already built out your work. So just to add a little more depth to what Ashanti and to what Shirley already have beautifully elaborated on.
Shomari, would you mind repeating the name of that resource again for us, please?
Yep. It is the NICSLA Strategy Guide, the National Inclusive Excellence Leadership Academy by Dr. Damon Williams. He's one of the lead thought leaders in the country on diversity, inclusion, and strategic diversity leadership. He has 2 books known as The Chief Diversity Officer and Strategic Diversity Leadership. I highly recommend everyone read Strategic Diversity Leadership by Dr. Damon Williams, and it'll give you a lot of depth, a lot of dynamic, and just a lot of intricacies to how these different systems work from a DEI standpoint.
Okay, I was going to say I won't address your specific question, but just from the community perspective, because everything I do comes from the community perspective, I'm concerned about the catch-up. What's the plan for the catch-up for the kids that we're going to leave behind? Because we know every day kids are being left behind. And so, you know, that's a conversation for the parking lot. It can't be addressed in this particular, but, you know, please put that in your parking lot, and because we have to have a plan for these kids. My fear is that we're going to, you know, each year start to see a gradual increase of the dropout rate because of the kids that we lost during this process in the various grades. So, you know, we start to see some some of the higher grades, you might see some immediate dropout, but then, you know, these kids that are down in 3rd, 4th grade that are not getting the resources they need to keep up, what's going to happen with them. My best friend, she's an assistant principal, and she's told me that by middle school, you've lost them. Totally. So if you don't catch them like by 3rd grade, 8 years old, and at least by the tail end of elementary school, by middle school, you've kind of lost them, and they just start to pull further and further away. And then I just want to go back a little bit just to when you talked about curriculum, I just want to add this piece because it's something that I always advocate for. And, you know, you get a lot of pushback from certain schools and school systems about celebrating Black History Month. And perhaps you can't celebrate, or we can't just do Black history, we need to do multicultural or whatever it is that you need to do. If you can't put it into the curriculum, then can we make it extra credit? Can we, you know, something as simple as, I remember an assignment, we came to Grand Rapids from California, and I remember an assignment that our son had where they each got assigned a last name, and they had to find someone famous, African-American person with, if the last was the letter M, you had to find somebody with the last name M and, you know, do a little report on who that person was. And then they took turns reporting out what they did. And so, you know, if you look at what you're doing with that information, because a lot of these kids are coming and all they see is negative information about kids of color, African-American kids or whatever. They see it, the parents aren't changing the channels that they watch only show negative. But here you are in class, it's just extra credit, but you're putting something positive in front of them. A lot of them don't know. They don't interact with kids that don't look like them on a regular basis, but they also don't know kids that are people that are professional, that are of color. They don't know all of the inventors and all of the history that African Americans have made. It's not just about slavery, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Luther King. You know, there's a lot more in between.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Affirmative.
And that's that neutralizing aspect that I was talking about. Maybe you can't put it in the official curriculum, but we can create opportunities for kids to learn. And perhaps if you hear about some of the great things that African Americans have done, it can counteract some of that negative information that you might be hearing in the home.
I think we're in a moment, I really appreciate Aquinas facilitating this space. I think we're in a moment and a window, an opportunity in our country because of the pandemic and its effect, and even the disparities of its effect on communities of color, in particular African American, Hispanic, Latinx people across the country. Let's jump on a jet plane. I'm not making it up. It's really real. I think also because of this awakening around racial injustice. It existed before, but there's just been this great awakening in our country. So I feel like we're within a window. And so if you are a white educator, a white school leader, a white higher educational professional on this call or viewing or listening to this recording, because this is being recorded, I want to offer you a roadmap from my colleague, Dena Simmons, D-E-N-A Simmons. And she really creates this roadmap for how to be an anti-racist educator. I'm going to walk you through it for hopefully 60 seconds. Number one, engage in vigilant self-awareness.
Yep.
Vigilant self-awareness, which means your identity, your privilege and power, sometimes your tendency to see things with just single narratives, or the single narratives that you have told yourself, and then even academic materials, et cetera, et cetera. Engage in vigilant self-awareness. Number two, acknowledge, if you want to become an anti-racist educator, acknowledge that racism and the ideology of white supremacy exist. It's alive and trying to grow within our country and affecting all of us. The third thing would be to study and to teach representative history. This is what India Mans was just talking about. There is a rich history of all people that is not in many textbooks, or there's a chapter, or there's a 28-day month, maybe, where which is the smallest month of the year, the 28 day. Sure. Where we are trying to highlight, African American history, et cetera. Teach and study representative history. And that is even one way. I saw a question around the Black males are all wanting to they see sports and becoming an athlete as their only way out. Well, have they even learned their history? Have they seen any other kinds of examples of Black men like them of different shades who are in different kinds of, who have taken different pathways of success, of achievement, right? So that they can see themselves. And if you can't get them to be a teacher in your school, can you invite them to your school to talk to the kids? They exist. They exist. All right, well, let me finish this roadmap. I know, Shimari, you're chomping at the bit. Here, I'm almost finished, man. Talk with students about race. Talk about race with your students. There are resources now to support you and frameworks to support you on how to talk to students about race, not just the people of color. You, as the white leader, as the white classroom teacher, can also have productive conversations with students about race. And then lastly, when you see racism, and we see it, and when you become more aware of racism, and you are really examining your bias, do something about it. That's how you become an anti-racist educator. Do something about it. Say something.
Yes.
Well, I might be penalized by my district or my principal. Well, come over to my school. Email me. We will find a job for you. Because we need more educators like that. Go ahead, Shimari.
All great points. And I will piggyback off of what Ashanti just said and affirm it, and also say, if these are the things that you want to do, and these are the things that you want your institution to do, then you have to be ready to realize that there is a cost to pay for this work. A lot of times this work is viewed through the lens of benevolence. And I am a benevolent person and I love to be benevolent, but at the same time, this work is specialized. A lot of the research around it is nuanced, and a lot of dedication, a lot of time, and a lot of manpower really goes into putting on workshops, into facilitating discussions, into having professional development opportunities, to have critical pedagogies of your curriculums. All of those things require a lot of time, energy, effort, and resources by whoever the facilitator of those services are. So when you are doing this work, just know that it should be incorporated into budgets in your strategic plan. It should be incorporated into discussions about where expenditures are going to go. And when we start to really take this seriously and make this an institutional pillar rather than an avenue for charity is when we will start to see positive, productive, and efficient growth and change alongst the lines of culture. That's all I was going to add.
And you could choose to lump us all into one category and make this a political conversation. This is not a political conversation. This is about addressing bias and systemic racism. And you can be a Democrat and address bias and systemic racism, and you can be a Republican and address bias and systemic racism.
Yes, sir.
So
Yeah.
don't assume that we're just all lumped into one category politically, et cetera. This is just about doing what is right for the children who are our future generation in this country. All children. I'm sorry, Dr. Johnson.
No, go right ahead. I just a couple thoughts that I have. One, and that is, most of you know that a lot of the racism and white privilege and power that is pervasive in school settings is quite subtle. It's covert. It's not overt. It's not in your face racism, because those people have been ostracized and ridiculed, but it is still there. So I think that what has to happen is teachers have to also go within and understand and acknowledge the trauma that has come out of communities of color, such as what is happening with Breonna Taylor and Trayvon Martin and all of this. There's some feelings of injustice that are in the community that are clearly not going to stop just because you walk into a school setting. So you have to be very deliberate in understanding the student that you're teaching. You have to be very deliberate in engaging in self-awareness, how your biases might be impacting students. Also, to really immerse yourself in Black history. Why not find out about that? And also giving students an opportunity to interact and learn other cultures as well. So it's not just good for teachers, it's good for students as well, because we're preparing them to work in an international, globalized workforce. And so they cannot think that having one mindset of working with only a homogeneous group of individuals they will not have that opportunity. Chamber of Commerce said years ago that cultural competency was the most imperative skill of the 21st century. So if you are not comfortable with working with all ethnicities, you're going to find yourself with some insurmountable challenges in an education setting.
I want to make one more comment quickly, Stephanie. I know we need to wrap up. There is also a racism of low expectations.
Oh, yeah.
There is a racism of having low expectations. And I need to also say, because you have a mostly African-American panel here, just because a child is an English language learner does not mean that they are not intelligent.
Yep.
Just because a child speaks in quote unquote broken English, ghetto English, whatever you want to call it, or whatever people call it, does not mean that they are not highly intelligent. There is a racism of low expectations. And sometimes it even manifests in schools, classrooms, and districts where children are the only child of color in their classroom in a suburban school district, where people are applying a profile to them and then lowering their expectations of them based on their assumptions or their single narratives that they have towards a specific group. So again, in wanting to be an anti-racist educator and to address bias and systemic racism, let's also deal with lower expectations because of assumptions that we are making, narratives that we have played in our head, things that we believed about specific racial groups or ethnic groups within the context of our country.
Okay. So I know we're down to the nub here, but what I want to just leave is with you is the impact that it has on the kids. And what keeps me diligent and using my voice to highlight these types of issues. Our son still, he's in his 3rd year of college, and he still has some scars from what happened to him in 8th grade. Just to 2nd year of college, taking him back. We're in a totally different state. He sees a school, and the school reminds him. So he doesn't like that school. He's never even been to that school. He doesn't know anything about the school, but he doesn't like that school because that school reminds him of this particular school that he went to. And I could, you know, list, if I had more time, I could list some other things. The impact trying to go to driver's training, had to take him 30 minutes across town because he was concerned that the type of kids he encountered in that 8th grade experience would populate this driver's training class that was right, you know, that was like 10 minutes from our home. And so you have to understand, and when you work at it from the perspective of the stain, the scar it leaves on the kids, you know, hopefully it will allow you to push a little harder, a little further, because you will run into, you know, in administration, you'll run into brick walls, or you'll run into people that don't want to deal with it. And, you know, there may be consequences in the fact that you did try to do something. And so I can't, you know, speak, you know, I'd have to just get up on the top of the building to help you understand the impact that it had. They wear that scar for the rest of their life. And so it's very important. And a lot of it is peer-to-peer. I know a lot of this conversation has been about what comes directly from the educator, but the most, you know, the thing that hurts the most, I think, comes from their peers, and, you know, being treated differently and having things inappropriately said to them by their peers. And just don't be complicit. Stop it in its tracks. As soon as you see it, cut it down right there. Stop it. Let them know it will not be tolerated in your classroom. You know, the biggest gift I have is the person that invited me to be on this panel. She knows who she is. She's one of the few, she was a principal at the time, and she's one of the few people that I've seen in Grand Rapids that jumped right on it and nipped it in the bud. You know, she couldn't stop the daily interactions that he was having, but she put every effort into what she was doing to try to make it better for him, and then tried to continue to work with me even after he graduated out of the school, so that no other child had that experience. And so you have to go at it from that way in order to tackle it. And she got consequences for working with, for continuing to work with me. There were consequences, and you have to be willing to, you know, know that there are consequences, and that, you know, there's something out there for you, something better.
India, thank you so much for ending us on such a personal story. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate all of your time tonight. We've had a very powerful and thoughtful evening, but this conversation, of course, does not stop here. As all of you know, these topics are ongoing discussions that are considered and supported in teacher preparation programs and all educational settings. We encourage all of you who are attending tonight to follow us on our Facebook page, and we'll post weekly materials to continue this conversation, specifically the materials that were referenced as well. Once again, thank you, Ashanti, Dr. Johnson, India, and Deacon Shomari. We appreciate your expertise and time. And thank you to all of those, to those of you who attended tonight. Please consider what action steps that were discussed tonight work for you and your role, and reach out with any of your questions or successes as we strive for an anti-racist PK12 classroom. Please have a safe and relaxing evening, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you.